Welcome back to another explainer. Now, I want you to imagine stepping into a graphic novel, but the panels here are dripping with rusted iron, deep shadows, and forgotten prayers. For those of you studying the deep, often fractured layers of the human psyche, today's explainer is going to be an absolutely thrilling ride. We're venturing into a grim, dark Gothic fable known as Dark Camelot. Now, this isn't your standard Arthurian legend full of shining knights and glory. No way. This is a brutal, unapologetic descent into the divided soul. It's a raw look at what actually happens when the mind goes to war with itself.
To really set the tone, just listen to this chilling declaration from our central figure, the Obsidian Doctor. I am the eye that does not turn away, the register of the cost, the ledger of every broken vow written in the ashes of the glass library. Unsettling, right? It instantly establishes this cold, Gothic, deeply clinical reality of navigating a fractured psychological state. There's no sugarcoating going on here. The mind is keeping a brutal tally of its own failures.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this agenda strictly as an anatomical chart guiding our descent through the mind's darkest layers today. We'll explore the kingdom of permanent night, the architects of the void, the awakening of the Obsidian Doctor, archives versus the ledger, weaponizing the inner shadow, and finally, the grave dance transformation.
Starting with Part 1, The Kingdom of Permanent Night, a psyche in ruins. Try to really set this scene in your mind. We're in an age of permanent night. This is a world where the throne of the mind, the central organizing principle of the self, is totally vacant. The air literally smells of rusted iron. It's a beautifully grim metaphor for a mind that has completely lost its internal leadership and structure, leaving behind nothing but the decaying architecture of what used to make sense.
And stepping right into this dark, vacant ruin is our lone traveler, the Silver Wolf. Now, psychologically speaking, this represents the conscious ego. It's wandering blindly under the oppressive shadow of the void, desperately searching for a grail, some source of light, a unifying purpose or ultimate meaning. But here's the devastating catch of this dark fable. That grail is notoriously empty. The ego is seeking salvation in an absolute abyss.
Which brings us to Part 2, Architects of the Void, the internal gods of stasis. You see, this mental fortress, this dark Camelot, it wasn't built by heroes. It was constructed by 3 higher men. These were architects who looked directly into the void, blinked, and completely shattered under the weight of it, breaking off into isolated psychological domains. They rule the ruins as the dark gods of this divided soul, and each one guards their own twisted coping mechanism.
Now, what's really interesting here is how clearly this fragmented mind is mapped out. First up, we have the Pale Inquisitor at the Iron Bridge, representing memory and guilt. His goal? Enforce absolute stasis to avoid the truth. Next, we have the Last Thinker in the Glass Library. He represents reason and contagion, and his aim is simply curating passive extinction by indexing data. Finally, we've got the Tarantula Preacher in the Uncanny Wood. He represents will and revenge, consuming others through predator law. So you have guilt, logic, and revenge, each offering a distinct, necrotic way to completely fail your psychological quest.
Moving to Part 3, The Obsidian Doctor Awakens, the clinical hand. We are transitioning now from the sterile, passive decay of those 3 architects to something much more active, surgical, and honestly, a lot more dangerous. Enter the Obsidian Doctor. He operates beneath those higher men as a Byronic acolyte, serving quite literally as the surgical hand for the dark gods, executing the mind's clinical pruning.
But what actually initiates the Doctor's arrival? It's the Crow. As psychology students, you'll recognize the Crow as a professional archetype of the subverted superego. It doesn't just sit back and watch. It's this icy, detached, observing consciousness that actively corners the struggling ego, forcing it to look right at its own destructive flaws. The Crow's detached judgment is what sets this entire dark psychomecia, this violent battle of the soul, into motion.
Just watch this terrifying clinical process unfold. Step 1. The Crow identifies the Doctor's deep desire to serve those fragmented dark gods. Step 2. This triggers a rush of mercurial energy, sparking an atavistic awakening. And Step 3. The Doctor physically transforms. He assumes the terrifying leather and mask of a humanoid plague doctor. This awakening turns him from a passive, underlying servant into a visceral, living manifestation of clinical pruning.
So, Part 4, Archives versus the Ledger, Reason versus Agony.
The crucial point here is the stark thematic juxtaposition between mere mental stasis and the raw, undeniable reality of agonizing psychological labor. We really have to compare how different parts of this divided soul process the inevitability of failure. Let's compare the Last Thinker's approach directly with the Obsidian Doctors. The dark god of reason, the Last Thinker, curates a mere ledger of nothingness. The messy, chaotic essence of life is just bottled up into sterile, indexed data in the glass library. It's totally passive extinction. But in stark contrast, the Obsidian Doctor's ledger is an active register of the cost that records every single broken vow. The doctor doesn't just file away your pain. No, he utilizes active clinical agony to force a grueling, hard-won transformation. It's passive data versus weaponized agony.
Which leads us perfectly into Part 5, Weaponizing the Inner Shadow, the Crucible of Guilt. If you're studying in the mechanics of the psyche, you need to understand that the Obsidian Doctor isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He isn't evil. Rather, he represents the agonizing necessity of confronting your internal shadows. As that subverted superego doing the dirty work, his clinical cruelty is actually a deeply required psychological mechanism. And this brilliantly illustrates how he operates. He mirrors a grueling Herculean struggle, literally turning raw psychic torment into a series of agonizing labors. He shackles the silver wolf, the ego, to the immense guilt of its own creation. But crucially, he also reminds the ego that it possesses the massive strength to shatter worlds. He weaponizes the traveler's guilt, yes, but he turns it into the very raw material required for the final labor of psychological growth. As the doctor heralds this final labor, he delivers this incredibly heavy truth to our traveler. Listen to this. The night will demand everything you are, for the final labor is not fought against monsters at the gates, but against the screaming shadow within your own divided soul. What an absolute gut punch. The real monsters aren't out there, they are inside. This realization forcefully pushes the traveler straight into the final internal execution phase of this entire psychodrama. Finally, we arrive at Part 6, the Grave Dance Transformation, Execution and Rebirth. We've reached the climax of our dark fable. This is where Faustian intellectual despair meets the absolute, undeniable necessity of a dark transformation. The forces of the mind simply can no longer exist in this fragmented, decaying stasis. Something has to break. Then, the violet gavel falls. Imagine this as a violent, terrifying psychological execution. When this gavel strikes, it violently crushes the internal gods together. It forces the memory of the Inquisitor, the reason of the thinker, and the will of the preacher to collide head-on with the Obsidian Doctor's sharp clinical insights. It forces a total, catastrophic collapse of the old mind. The clinical pruning is officially complete. This violent clinical pruning leaves only one path forward, and that is the grave dance. This is the ultimate psychological rebirth. The traveler realizes the grail is indeed empty and the old architects have completely failed. So, instead of weeping in the dark, they dance. The grave dance is the act of actively creating your own meaning and dancing upon the ruins of the necrotic extreme. It is the hard-won victory of an ego that chooses active creation over total regression into a mindless man-beast. So, I'll leave you with this final piercing question to ponder. Will you succumb to total regression into a man-beast, or will you endure the grueling grave dance to heal your own divided soul? This grim fable isn't just about some fictional dark Camelot. It forces us to look at the inevitable and terrifying fate of our own internal struggles. You either confront the dark within, or you let it consume you entirely. Thank you so much for diving into the abyss with me today. Keep exploring, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.